Okay, so I'm going to pass this off to Peggy because she can introduce herself better than I can. And I'm going to be quiet and turn off because you did not come here to see me tonight.
Thank you, Nicole. It's really wonderful to be back with the Indian Valley Public Library. And I will start sharing my screen here. And here we go. In my last presentation, I shared stories with you of men from your area and around Telford who had been seagoing cowboys. And these men delivered livestock to Europe after World War II to help the devastated countries rebuild. And my grandfather, Abraham Theodore Reiff, had also been a seagoing cowboy. And it was an envelope of photos from Grandpa's trip to Poland in 1946 with a load of horses that got me started on this journey of research and writing and speaking about the seagoing cowboys and the related history of the Heifer Project, which is today's Heifer International, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. And that was 20 years ago when I started this journey. Well, as I poured through archival materials and as I interviewed men that I knew had been part of this history, or people that I knew had been part of this history, one of the themes that I discovered was that of turning swords into plowshares, a theme of transforming a warring world into a more peaceful world. So when Nicole asked me if I would have something to share that would fit your summer reading theme of oceans of possibilities, I thought about this theme, and particularly the role that the livestock ships crossing the oceans had played in it. And it's that story that I'd like to share with you tonight. So to set the context for the story, I'm going to take you back to World War I and into the life of a young Church of the Brethren man named Dan West. Well, the Church of the Brethren was founded in 1708 on the belief that all war is sin. But when World War I rolled around, the church was unprepared with any kind of alternative service with the government for their young men. So they had three choices. They could either serve in the military in combat, they could go into the military as a non-combatant conscientious objector, a CO, or they could choose to go to prison, which many of them did. Well, Dan West was one of these young men facing this dilemma. And at age 24, he was drafted into the Army in May of 1918. And West decided to sign up as a CO to test the boundaries of his conscientious objection, he said. So when he was assigned to the 39th Machine Gun Battalion, he knew he couldn't even carry a gun, let alone shoot one. And he said years later, I went to my new captain to get released. He cursed me hard, evidently to change my mind, but he didn't. A few hours later, I went back with a new idea to offer to go to the Fort Leavenworth Penitentiary. My captain did not curse me anymore, but said he could not move me on then. After a few hard weeks, I was assigned to the Quartermaster Corps, and this was in South Carolina. There, I did not kill anybody, but I felt a part of a killing machine that still hurts my conscience. And I developed a new goal: to work for peace, not for war. That has lasted ever since. Swords into plowshares in the life of Dan West. Well, fast forward 2 decades, and that passion for doing as much for peace as a soldier does for war led Dan West to become the peace representative for the Church of the Brethren. So in 1937, during the Spanish Civil War, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, invited the Brethren to join them in Spain on a project to provide relief for women and children who were caught in the throes of the war. And they were to work on both sides of the conflict. Dan West was sent as the Church of the Brethren representative. And during his several months there, he observed children dying from a shortage of powdered milk. And this just tore at his heart. And he thought of his own little girl at home. And he said, this idea struck me hard. Suppose we were unable to provide plenty of food for her right now. I was suddenly determined to do something for these children. And that something was his idea of sending cows to Spain so the people would be able to feed themselves. Simple solution, right? Well, for the optimist that Dan West was, yes, but it would take some heavy convincing for his colleagues at home. It took him 4 years, but finally in April of 1942, the Church of the Brethren District Men's Work of Northern Indiana, where West was living, took hold of his vision, and they adopted West's plan for Cattle for Europe. A few months later, the denomination's Brethren Service Committee then adopted it as a national program, and they called it the Heifer Project. It was also called Heifers for Relief at times. And for those of you who don't know, a heifer in Dan West's term is a cow not yet. Once a heifer births its first calf, then it becomes a cow. Well, this idea took hold. Farmers around the country started raising calves to be sent to Europe, and other denominations joined the program, and hundreds of heifers were ready to go by the end of 1943. But World War II was raging by then, and shipping across the oceans were just impossible. So the first shipment of the Heifer Project went to Puerto Rico in July of 1944. Well, when the war ended, the next May of 1945, another organization entered the picture: the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. That's always a mouthful. It was created during the war, about the same time that the Heifer Project was being put together. It was created by 44 of the Allied nations, called themselves the United Nations. This was a precursor to the UN that we know today. It wasn't the same thing. UNRWA, as it was called by its initials, had not planned on including live cargo in their shipments for agricultural rehabilitation. But the Brethren Service Committee and Heifer Project leaders had been lobbying UNRWA to include Heifer Project animals in their shipments. So when the Near East Foundation requested 6 purebred bulls for their artificial insemination program in Greece to jumpstart the recovery of their dairy industry, UNRWA decided to do a test run with the Heifer Project providing the bulls. And that trip is quite a story in itself. And if you use the internet, you can find on my blog, on my Seagoing Cowboys website, this story behind it. Just put in the search box, bulls and Greece, and you'll find the story there. Well, this shipment of bulls was successful, and requests were coming into UNRWA from the recipient countries for livestock to UNRWA's agricultural division. So they decided they would include some live cargo in their plans after all. They had 6 ships that were immediately available to them through the War Shipping Administration. There were ships that had been outfitted to carry mules during the war. But UNRWA had a problem. Where would they find the men to tend these animals? At that time, most of the men were either still in the military or in the defense industry. Well, UNRWA knew that the Church of the Brethren was a mostly rural denomination, so maybe they could find enough men on farm deferment to do the job. Well, the Brethren Service Committee's executive, M.R. Ziegler, a real mover and a shaker, got on the phone and he rounded up enough men for those first several trips. Then UNRWA came back to the Brethren with a much larger request. Would the Brethren Service Committee recruit all of the cattle tenders that UNRWA would need to ship some 200,000 heifers, horses, and mules to Europe? You can believe it was with much fear and trembling that the Brethren Service Committee agreed to contract with UNRWA to serve as their recruiting agency. So in return, UNRWA agreed to ship Heifer Project animals free of charge and under the terms of the Heifer Project, meaning the animals would be given to the neediest of people, whereas UNRWA recipients had to pay a little bit. So the Seagoing Cowboy program was born with its headquarters at the Brethren Service Center in New Windsor, Maryland. Well, it soon became evident to UNRWA that they would need more than these first 6 ships for this livestock program. And this is where the story becomes one of turning swords into plowshares. With the help of the War Shipping Administration, UNRWA took armed Liberty and Victory ships that had been built in mass during the war for the movement of troops and supplies, and they converted these vessels into livestock carriers. They removed the guns from the gun decks, as you can see in this picture here, the deck up there on top, and they built stalls for the animals. Well, over the course of its less than 2-year active lifespan then, UNRWA employed 73 different ships. And altogether, these ships made a total of 360 trips across the oceans, transporting some 300,000 animals, of which about 4,000 were from the Heifer Project, including those that are in this slide here. Swords into plowshares. Well, these 73 ships included 23 Liberty ships. They were usually named after people, and 46 Victory ships, usually named after places, colleges, or cities. The Liberties were built first, earlier in the war, and there were 2 types. The regular Liberty would hold about 335 animals, and it required 12 cattle tenders, 1 supervisor, and 1 veterinarian. The Victory ships were built later in the war, and they were larger and sturdier and faster than the Liberties, and held around 800 animals, which required 32 cattle tenders, 1 supervisor, and 2 foremen, and 2 veterinarians. The second type of Liberty ship was a class that was built for transporting military tanks and other large equipment. And these ships had 4 holds where the regular Liberty ship had 5, so the holds were bigger. And it had the same capacity then as a Victory ship, but the slower speed of a Liberty. It could take 2 months or more for a round trip on a Liberty ship, whereas a Victory could make the same trip in about 4 to 6 weeks. And UNRWA paid the Seagoing Cowboys $150 per trip, no matter how long it took. It was 4 weeks, it was 4 months, they got the same pay. So many college-age cowboys hoped and prayed to be assigned to a victory ship. And then they could get 2 or 3 trips in during the summer, and they could pay for their whole next year of college, which some of them did. Well, another piece of this swords into plowshares story then is what happened to the cowboys themselves. So who were these seagoing cowboys? Well, the UNRWA Livestock Program Historical Report says they were farmers, preachers, teachers, students, veterans, conscientious objectors, ne'er-do-wells, and doctors, carpenters, plumbers, painters, and importers. They came from a diversity of religious affiliation and racial backgrounds from nearly every state in the Union as well as Canada. Truly, as comprehensive a cross-section of American life as could be found, the report says. About 7,000 men and boys, ages 16 to 72, made these UNRWA trips. And some 15-year-olds snuck in there too. Why would a religious organization like the Brethren Service Committee agree to participate in such a secular program? Well, the answer is in the UNRWA Livestock Program Historical Report, where it gives the fundamental reasons why the BSC accepted this task. First was the belief that the livestock program was one which was extremely significant for the rebuilding of war-devastated countries. And then the belief that for many, such a trip would be an unusually broadening and educational experience. And this experience would then express itself in an increased interest in the wider relief programs of the various churches. It would provide a better understanding of the effects of war on people's lives. And it would create an active desire to build a better world. The report says, these may have been idealistic motivations, but numerous examples can now be cited to prove the justification of such reasoning. And mind you, this was written soon after UNRWA disbanded in 1947, and they were already seeing these results. It's obvious from this report then that the Brethren Service Committee was very intentional about what it hoped the seagoing cowboys would gain from their experiences. So what did these men experience? As I interviewed them, their stories were just so fascinating and compelling and full of drama and danger and adventure and humor and even an occasional romance. And I was hooked, enough to keep me at it for these 20 years. And here's a sampling that will illustrate some of those points. Working on a ship was a dangerous place, with the swinging hay bales, and when they pulled up the hay that knocked some of the cowboys down a hold or two. And there was a danger of horse bites. You can see how close they were to the backs of the cowboys. He was going down the aisle here. And there was a danger of mines that were still in the waters after the war, which many a ship dodged and some even hit. And I don't have any photos of any of those. There were storms at sea. There were deaths of animals at sea and births at sea, complete with a calf beauty contest on this ship that went to China. It was a long ride, and some of those heifers just couldn't wait until they got there. And there was seasickness, feeling 1 minute like you're gonna die, and the next minute being afraid you won't. Many a cowboy told me that. Then there was exploration of the recipient country, be it Greece with its many antiquities, or Italy, where this crew got to go to Rome. Some made it to Venice, or China, where a few cowboys even made it to the Great Wall and almost missed their ship trying to get back to it. And occasionally there was interaction with grateful recipients. This didn't happen very often, but when it did, it was really a very meaningful and touching experience. And as I said, there was even an occasional romance. This one was built over several trips this cowboy took to Poland. And I think it was on about his 4th trip that he married Inga, and his next trip, which was the last one that he'd have been able to take, smuggled her out. It's quite a story. But most of all, the cowboys witnessed the aftermath of war, especially in Germany, as in these 2 pictures, where the livestock was shipped overland to Czechoslovakia. Germany was not a receiving country for UNRWA because it had been, it was not one of the allies, it had been an enemy. And the devastation in Poland, where over 40% of UNRWA's shipments went. These cowboys visited battlefields, and some got to see the Stutthof concentration camp. And some of the very earliest cowboys were taken to this Nazi medical research facility, which was later put off limits then, also known as the human soap factory. Here, the Nazis experimented with making soap out of human fat and making leather out of human skin. It was quite horrendous what the cowboys saw here. There's deniers out there who say this never took place, but these men saw it, and it was horrible. But most of all, they saw the near total destruction of the once beautiful city of Danzig. Its Polish name is Gdansk. Looks a lot like the images we're seeing of Ukraine today, doesn't it? Well, we've seen how the military ships were transformed into livestock carriers, but there was another transformation that often happened, and that was a swords into plowshares story in the lives of the cowboys themselves, of many of them. And I'll use Harvey Cox as my example. Cox is Harvard University's Hollis Professor of Divinity Emeritus, probably best known for his book, The Secular City. And Harvey Cox was a seagoing cowboy. And he sums up well the personal impact of his trip in his book, Just As I Am. The book chronicles his faith journey. And despite having Quaker roots, Cox had a secret desire during high school to take part in the war. But the war ended before he had a chance. So when he learned about the livestock trips, he jumped at the opportunity to go to Europe. At age 17, between his junior and senior years of high school, he signed on to this crew on the SS Robert W. Hart that delivered both Heifer Project and UNRWA animals to Poland in the summer of 1946. And Cox says in his book, Herman Melville has written somewhere that the ship he first sailed on was his Yale and Harvard. Although I later attended both those institutions, I know what he meant. I learned more and grew up more during those weeks on the Robert Hart than during any other period of my life. But when the ship arrived in Poland, it didn't take long for Cox to become disillusioned. On a walk around Gdansk, he witnessed the rubble, the smells, the grimy, ill-clad children begging for candy, the pimps soliciting for their sisters or daughters. People were desperate for money and food any way they could get it. And he became obsessed with the children. He says, slowly I began to realize something. The war I had seen from the secure perspective of high school and had secretly hoped would last long enough so that I could be in it, had done all this to Gdansk. The voyage of the Robert Hart took me to a place where, even without a shot being fired at me, I found out something about who I was and what my life was meant to be. Well, Cox went on then to become an ardent peace activist, as described in the rest of his book, Swords into Plowshares. Many a cowboy came home determined to do all they could for peace, and many channeled their lives into ministerial or service-oriented professions. Pastor Robert Eby said of his trip, although our stay in Poland was short, still we saw enough of the horrors of war to make us preach peace as we had never preached it before. The Brethren Service Committee's motivations had been realized. The livestock trips had indeed resulted in an unusually broadening and educational experience for the Seagoing Cowboys, which created a better understanding of the effects of war on people's lives, an active desire to build a better world, and an increased interest in the wider relief programs of the various churches. And on that last point, the cowboys came home all across the country, telling their stories of the devastation and the tremendous need in Europe that they had witnessed. They talked to anyone who would listen, to their friends, their families, their schools, their churches, their newspapers. And this testimony gave a boost to relief organizations such as the Mennonite Central Committee and Church World Service and the Heifer Project. And it's the Heifer Project that I want to focus on now. When UNRWA disbanded in early 1947, it left the Heifer Project at a critical juncture. It had just lost its free shipping, and it had always operated on a shoestring, and it didn't have the means to pay for hiring ships. At that point, they could easily have just blessed what they had done and terminated the program. But with the pressing need overseas, the committee vowed to continue. Its leaders had a passion for peace that brings us to one more piece of this Swords into Plowshares story. The first country that the Heifer Project sent animals to after UNRWA folded was an enemy country, Japan, the country that had pulled the United States into World War II. The Brethren Service Committee and the Heifer Project had been wanting to get into this former enemy country for some time, but it was militarily occupied after the war, with General Douglas MacArthur in the lead as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, known by its initials, SCAP, S-C-A-P. In order to enter Japan, the Heifer Project would have to work through the US Army. So, like the UNRWA partnership, this is another story of strange bedfellows. This time, a pacifist religious organization partnering not with a secular organization like UNRWA, but with the military. Well, Dan West had a good friend named Kermit Eby. And Kermit Eby paved the way for the Heifer Project in March of 1946. General MacArthur had requested the US War Department to send a group of American educators to Japan to advise and consult with SCAP on the problems relating to education in the country. Well, MacArthur wanted to assist the Japanese government in modernizing their educational system. And Kermit Eby was one of 27 educators who were selected for this task. And he spent that whole month of March, 1946, in Japan. Well, soon after he got back to the United States, Dan West spoke with him. And West wrote to his wife, Lucy, "Kermit is all aglow. He said he pounded the desk as hard to MacArthur as he does for me. He thinks Mac a benign despot who has discovered democracy as Columbus discovered America." Well, during Eby's meeting with MacArthur then, Eby promised 75 heifers and 3 bulls to restock the Hokkaido Imperial University farms. And the island of Hokkaido would be the equivalent of Wisconsin, our Wisconsin, to the dairy industry there. Well, Heifer Project's executive director, Benjamin Bushong, followed up on Eby's proposal. He pursued potential shipments to Japan with the US War Department. And by that September of 1946, the War Department had given the go-ahead, the approval for Heifer Project to send 25 purebred bulls to Japan, with the Army covering the cost of shipping and all the supplies needed on the ship. On April 16, 1947, then, the Alfred I. DuPont, one of the US Army's Liberty ships, departed from Pier 90 in San Francisco, California, with 25 of the best purebred Holstein bulls in the country, and 3 seagoing cowboys. These were men who had worked with the Heifer Project in various ways, and they had been assigned the job of working out the plans for this shipment and carrying it through. Norman Hostetler from Ohio was an animal husbandry graduate, and he had been given the job of selecting these bulls. And he said that not one breeder he talked with objected to sending bulls to our former enemy country. There's an interesting piece of this story that shows another transformation. Hostetler had to find a collection center for these bulls where they could be gathered before they were put on the ship. And he chose the Stanislaus County Fairgrounds in Turlock, outside of San Francisco. And 5 years earlier, this fairground had served as a temporary detention center for Japanese Americans. They were held there before being sent inland to the various concentration camps. And it was called the Turlock Assembly Center. In 1942, this fairgrounds had held Japanese Americans against their will. Now, in 1947, it held bulls of goodwill for Japan. Well, this shipment of bulls turned out to be a profound moment in history, not only for the experience of a lifetime for these 3 young men, but for Japan and the US Army as well. Hostetler said of their arrival in Yokohama, "Our reception at shipside was amazing. There were at least 15 photographers there, including the Japanese, as well as the Army. We noticed the Associated Press also. Army officials told us that our shipment was the most important one to have entered Japan since the war, insofar as the Japanese are concerned. Then, when they learn that the animals are a gift of the Christians of America, they are overwhelmed. They can scarcely imagine a gift of 25 bulls, the value of one being about 30,000 yen. Well, the bulls were put into, excuse me, wet my whistle here. The bulls were put into quarantine for a period, and the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry then sponsored a festive, colorful ceremony of the bulls for the official transfer of the animals from the Heifer Project to the people of Japan. And Hostetler spoke on behalf of the Heifer Project. He said, "Your neighbors, the Christians in the United States, send their greetings to the people of Japan. They extend their sympathy and understanding to you in the gigantic task of reconstruction and rehabilitation confronting you as a nation which has suffered the ravages of war." He gave a brief explanation about the Heifer Project and its desire through its gifts of animals, quote, "to bind the nations together with international goodwill," end of quote. Speeches by US Army and Japanese officials followed, emphasizing the importance of the occasion. Seagoing Cowboy Charles France reported then to the Heifer Project office saying, "The sun danced royally on the red and white striped banners. There were half a dozen photographers present, and the occasion and hospitality really outdid itself for us Occidentals. Tea, beer, soda, water, peanuts, fruit, meat, and flowers followed the ceremony. We'll never forget the occasion." Well, the third cowboy, Martin Straight, told the Heifer Project office, "We three kings of Orient are, and I'm not fooling. Pictures of the animals have appeared in most of the papers, and the good news has spread to the farthest prefecture." Well, the next 2.5 months overflowed with Japanese hospitality as the threesome traveled around the country, visiting the 16 experimental farms and breeding stations where the Heifer Project bulls had been distributed. France said, "Everyone with whom we have dealt has been overly considerate and gracious. They leave nothing to be desired in the way of hospitality. We have stayed at a Warm Springs hotel and a seaside inn at their expense, and they have arranged for every meal to be a banquet, occasionally followed by gifts of small items from a prefectural government, farmers association, or some similar enterprise." But the trip to Japan had its sobering aspects as well. Hostetler said, "We saw much heart-rending devastation, notably in Tokyo and Hiroshima. And in Hiroshima, they had the opportunity to have tea with the city's mayor." I believe this photo was taken from that building. "We talked with him for more than an hour," Straight said, "about his reconstruction plans for the city, current attitudes of Hiroshima residents, the material and spiritual damage of the atomic bomb, and the annual Peace Festival, which was being held for its initial time on the anniversary of the A-bomb. Another courageous display of faith in the future and their ambitious desire to help accomplish what so often seems only a dream away." Well, after he returned home then, Straight summed up his experience this way: "I thank God that the privilege of visiting Japan was granted to me, that I might be an ambassador of peace-loving forces toward helping to strengthen the common bonds between us. Through this gift of dairy cattle, the concerned people of our country will help build and develop harmonious and prosperous relationships by such a display of brotherly love. Swords into plowshares." Through their gift of bulls and the witness of these three ambassadors of peace, the Heifer Project was helping the Army in its attempts to bring peaceful resolution to the most disastrous acts of World War II. On the other side of the globe, then, the Heifer Project was making attempts to reach out to another former enemy, West Germany. The occupation army there was not quite as amenable in that as that in Japan, however, so it took longer. By 1949, this new country was reeling in dual consequences. Not only did they have the hardships created by the devastation of war for its population, but also the results of the Potsdam Agreement at the war's end. This agreement gave all East European countries permission to send people of German heritage living in their countries back to Germany. So West Germany had to absorb some 10 to 12 million of these displaced persons in a landmass slightly smaller at the time than our state of Oregon. Can you imagine Oregon absorbing 10 to 12 million people today in the best of times? Well, it was to these displaced persons then that the Heifer Project reached out. Throughout the decade of the 1950s, they sent 4,000 head of heifers and bulls to these displaced people who had had small farms before the war. And I'd like to close with a translated thank you letter from one of those recipients that I found in Heifer International's archives. It's from Yugoslavian refugee Jakob Renner, written to his donor, and this isn't his family here, this is a different family in the picture. His donor was Mr. Russell Hartzler of Michigan, and the letter was written in October of 1949. Mr. Renner tells first about the difficulties of having to leave their 100-acre farm in Yugoslavia that had been in their family for 5 generations. And of finally, after passing many refugee camps, relocating in a German village with only 5 acres of very sandy, bad soil, he said. And he concludes his letter like this. My dear Mr. Hartzler, it surely takes lots of love to give a cow away, but you hardly know, and I can't express what a great joy you gave to my whole family. It's hard to say what it means after 5 years to have a cow in the barn again. There came many packages from the US, and always my daughter asked, Daddy, don't we have any relatives there so that they could send us a package also? I just could comfort her with the words, don't worry, God will carry us through the need. And now look, an unknown human being gave us through God's blessing, not a little package, no, he gave us a life to help us out of the deep need. It isn't only the material value alone, it meant so much more to us. We received more courage for living. Well, Heifer Project continued its work, sending goats to Japan and Okinawa, sending hatching eggs to Korea during the Korean War, and they reached out to Russia in the height of the Cold War with a shipment of heifers in 1956, making friends out of enemies, turning swords into plowshares, oceans of possibilities.
Thank you very much, Peggy. That was very insightful. At this point, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask Peggy. Just remember this is being recorded and it'll be shared out as well. You can also put any of your questions in the chat and I will read them out for you. I see Gloria has unmuted herself, so I'll let her go speak.
I appreciate your work on this project, Peggy. My uncle, Ivan Patterson, participated in the Cowboys. He went to Poland and to China after the war with loads of horses and tractors.
Mhm. Yeah, Ivan was one of the cowboys that I interviewed. He was one of the first ones actually that I interviewed. And I believe that his crew was one of those that was taken to the Nazi medical research facility.
Really? I didn't realize that.
I think I'm correct on that. I might.
His brother Carl had been a conscientious objector in World War II and was I think in Maryland at the medical. They were testing to see how little people could eat and survive.
Yeah, he was one of the human guinea pigs.
Yeah, one of the guinea pigs of testing diet on people.
Oh, thank you for sharing. Tom, did you need help unmuting? And I also see Barb as well from Illinois. If one of you want to speak, you can go ahead.
My dad was also a cowboy, and he went to Germany in 1955.
What was his name?
Sorry?
What was his name?
Harry Culver.
Okay.
And his best friend went along. He was Clarence Motes.
Nice.
They went from the Bethlehem area, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, over to either Bremen or Bremenhaven. They landed.
Probably Bremen. Most of them ended up in Bremen. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
They might stop in Bremerhaven first to unload some things, but the cattle usually were unloaded in Bremen.
Yeah, hi, Mary Lou. This is Bill Mose. My father was Reverend Mose, who went with your father, Harry Culver.
Yes.
Good to see you.
Thank you. It's good to, I can't see you. I don't know what
Well,
I have.
I'm trying.
Let's see. I don't know how to do this, do you?
All right, I see Isabella has her hand up.
Hi, Isabella.
Hi, thank you. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing all these very inspiring stories. I was curious to know more about how, or did the Heifer Project intentionally communicate with these once enemy countries to send livestock there intentionally to I guess alleviate the tension between the US and those countries, or was it more of a coincidence that that's where the need was?
It was very intentional. Very intentional. Yeah. And they had actually been working at it during the war as well, trying to lay the groundwork for it. Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
This is Barb from Illinois. Peggy and I have crossed paths because of the Cowboys and being heifer volunteers over the past few years. And I live in central Illinois, which is an area where there are a lot of brethren, generational families. And I got interested in trying to find out if there were any cowboys around here. And it took me about 2 to 3 years, and I've located 12. They're not all still living, but I got their stories from family members. One gentleman that's still alive, he and his brother were both cowboys. And then in the course of my research, I found some flying cowboys. They were up in the 50s, and they were actually taking livestock in airplanes. They would transport them by truck to the Florida area and then fly them to some of the South American countries. So that was kind of an interesting addition to my seagoing cowboy story.
Yeah, thanks, Barb. And there were also flying cowgirls.
Yes, yes, and I knew her too, or the one that was that heifer. Yeah.
Once during the UNRWA years, the cowboys had to join the merchant marine in order to be able to work on a ship. But after UNRWA, Heifer no longer worked through the merchant marine, and then women could start participating as well. So
one of the gentlemen I discovered that had been a cowboy, I was working with his son and daughter-in-law. His daughter-in-law was actually writing a story about me and my work with Heifer, and I started talking about these cowboys, and she all of a sudden got this funny look on her face, and she looked across at her husband and she said, "Ken, this is what your dad has been trying to tell us about." And he had dementia, and he was in a residential facility, and he kept talking about being on a ship with all these cows, and they thought he was just, off in La La Land. And so after I got some pictures from some of the other guys around here that were all on the same ship, we went to his residential facility, and the daughter-in-law said, "Now, don't be disappointed if he has no idea why we're here." And I had gotten one of the cowboy certificates, like they had given to all the men, for him to take. And as soon as he had those pictures in his hand, he was just like he was back there. There was no evidence of dementia whatsoever.
yeah, those experiences were so formative that they were indelible in a lot of these men's minds. They just had real clear recollections.
Yeah.
That's very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know about the flying aspect of it. That's something I would love to learn more about in the future. I think that would be very interesting. Does anyone have anything else to share, or any other additional questions to ask? We still have a few minutes before we end for tonight.
I'd just like to thank you, Peggy, for all you do. I read your monthly blog and actually print it out and keep it on file. I have a whole folder full, so thank you.
Me too.
You're very welcome.
I see Ella's hand again.
Thank you. I had a question. What resources do you recommend looking into to learn more about the cowboys?
My website, my blog.
Okay, I'll look into that.
There's not much else there. It's been, for me, it's been kind of like putting a patchwork quilt together, because I get a piece here and a piece there and a piece there. And the biggest archive of Seagoing Cowboy materials is right here on the shelves in my office.
That's actually a question I had for you, Peggy. So what do you envision with all your research? What's the next step? How are you going to continue this legacy, I guess?
Well, I've been doing that with my blog for, I think I'm in the 6th year of that now. So there's a good bit of history there. I'm working on a history of the first decade of the Heifer Project. I've been in the writing stage of that for 2.5 years now, and I'm not quite halfway through. So it's a humongous project with so much information to filter out. I would like to do a book on the Seagoing Cowboys, yet an adult book. I do have the children's picture book, The Seagoing Cowboy, that's been published. Some other children's stories, but who knows? It's really hard to get published these days. So, and self-publishing takes a lot of money to do it. So time will tell.
Thank you.
I have a quick question for Peggy. Peggy, I hope you remember me. I'm Josh Smith from the American
Yes.
Marine Museum.
Yes.
How I'm the one who keeps on needling you about get the book published, right?
Yeah.
And I think it could be published for starters. But have you worked with the United Nations archives? Because in my experience, they were very bureaucratic and not really all that helpful.
Yeah, I did spend, I spent a week and then a couple years later, a few days there at, going through the UNRWA materials at the UN archives. And I did get a good bunch of stuff from them. So yeah, I need to go back because they've got a lot of photos that I was just at the point of getting into their photos when I had to go home and haven't had a chance to get back. So.
All right. So if we don't have anything else tonight, I just want to thank all of you for attending. We will be sending out a copy of this presentation as well, so you can share it with any of your friends who are not able to make it tonight. I want to thank you, Peggy, for doing this again, and reviewing some of the things we know about it, but also adding to the story and the narrative. And I wish you the best of luck, and I want everyone to have a great rest of the evening. Farewell, everyone.
Thanks so much, Nicole.
Thank you.
Thank you.